We are going to get started. Thank you for all joining us today. We are so excited to have you all here with us. My name is Cynthia LaRue, and I am with Diopath. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. The webinar today, of course, is Cyber Risk is Business Risk. And we're going to get going. To start out with, we're going to introduce our panelists. We have a wonderful panel today presenting this webinar to you. We have Chuck Arrico. He's our Executive Vice President and co-founder of Diopath. We also have James Melchior, our Chief Technology Officer. And we also have Sean Trojak, who is our IT Security Practice Lead. So these are going to be our three experts today leading you through our content. A couple of housekeeping issues. Everyone that's been brought into the webinar, you are on mute. However, there is a little raise hand feature in the WebEx, so you can raise your hand and you can also chat me a question. So feel free to do that throughout the webinar. We will be opening up at the end of the session a full Q&A, a full Q&A portion of the webinar. So we absolutely want to hear questions and make this interactive at the end. So that will be our last slide of the day. And with that, we'll get going. This is our agenda for today for the webinar. We're going to go over a quick Diopath overview. We want to make sure we clearly outline to you our webinar objectives. We're going to talk about the top security trends, security catalyst, risk to business, security cycle journey, IT governance, a path forward, what is managed security, and like I said, we're going to have that Q&A section at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the first Diopath overview slide to Chuck Arrico. Chuck, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. Appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. We thought we would give you just a very quick overview of Diopath. Really, the main goal is to help you understand why we feel we are qualified to be giving this webinar from a security standpoint. So, very quickly, company is about 25 years old, founded in 1996, and we serve really the small business to enterprise, federal, state, government, and education markets. In total, probably about 10 different industries in 65 cities throughout the U.S., Mexico, South America, and Europe. Most importantly, after the 9/11 events happened, the 9/11 Commission report basically said that the North American Liability Corporation had to establish cybersecurity guidelines for both physical and cyber terrorist attacks in around 2005, 2006. It basically said the United States critical infrastructure must be secure to prevent those type of cyber and physical terrorist attacks. So we're talking about our water districts, our electric grid, our pipelines, our oil and gas infrastructures. And Diopath was fortunately awarded that contract by the federal government, by Department of Homeland Security, to help write those guidelines that are now still in place today, that went effective in January of 2010. And those guidelines, which Diopath wrote the very first revision for and have updated since, are in use today. And so we have a very, very deep practice when it comes to security programs, security policies and procedures, and then in the actual technical cyber and physical side of it. And we also, as part of that process, obtained a top secret facility clearance with the U.S. federal government. And so basically what that means is that we are able to design, install, and more importantly, provide the ongoing security management of top secret, and what they call SBU, sensitive but unclassified computing network infrastructure. So that's a very brief history of our qualifications and why we feel we're able to speak on this topic. And we really do appreciate you listening for the next 35, 45 minutes on the areas that we see that are going to be very critical in this unfortunately growing industry. Okay, Cynthia. Yeah, thank you. So really, what are the objectives of this webinar? When you look at the number and types of security breaches that we as a company have been asked to help resolve over the last 15 years, it would and really should make the average business owner or C-level executive, technology specialist extremely aware of the potential damage that could happen to their business, right? And unfortunately, the types and the frequencies of new security threats, they keep evolving every day, and they're more sophisticated than we've ever experienced in the past. For decades, you have this imaginary line that separated cybersecurity from the actual, quote, the business. And typically, most board members and senior executives, they're really not that well versed in cybersecurity, nor do they really understand the impact that it has on the business. And so at the same time, many security leaders approach security really purely as a technical challenge dictated by technology and regulation. However, unfortunately, following years of insignificant spend, unsatisfactory results, both the security and the business leaders are now starting to recognize that they've been asking the wrong questions all along, and they've been taking the wrong approach. And what I mean by that is that business and security leaders now are really being challenged to change the way they approach cybersecurity and the associated risk with it. So consequently, the good news is we're now seeing businesses starting to have an urgency to treat cybersecurity as a business decision, no longer a technology decision. And so to sum all these issues up, this webinar, coming back to what is the objective of it, it's really intended to educate you, our audience, on three specific topics. The first one is the importance of treating cybersecurity as a very high priority business decision, right? It's not just a technology decision anymore. It's a priority business decision. The second objective is to help educate you on some of the top security trends that we're seeing as a company, how we deal with them and how we address them in the marketplace. And then third, to try and share with you and give you some sound business approaches that you can take to organizations. Okay, Cynthia, sorry, next slide.
And Chuck, we do have a question.
So, absolutely.
We do have a question that's come in from Christopher Wood. As a Chinese U.S. company, should we remove our existing, and I apologize for mispronouncing this, Huawei, Huawei infrastructure, or plan for its obsolescence?
Great question. I'm going to refer to Sean on that, as he is the one from a pure security standpoint would be able to answer that from a technical perspective. Sean?
My biggest comment on that would just be the unknown unknowns. So given all the things that we're seeing in that space, particularly with some of the political battles that have occurred as well, you just don't know what's going to happen in that space. So if it were up to me, I think I would probably try to transition away from that type of thing. And let me add just a little bit more to that. I was at another vendor's conference probably about 3-4 months ago, and one of the comments they had made was that they're on the supply chain side, they had enough equipment and things ready to go, but that supply was going to start to run out just due to all the political things that were occurring. So not even making a comment on whether that equipment is secure or not and the things that are occurring there, but just from a supply chain standpoint, I consider looking at other options. Back to you, Chuck.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sean. Go ahead, Chuck, and we can start back to the presentation.
Yeah, so I think it was Chris that asked that question. If that didn't answer your question completely, please let us know, and we'll attempt to answer it another way, but hopefully that did. And by the way, thanks for the questions. This is intended to be interactive. We don't want to just sit here and talk the whole time. So thanks for that question. Please keep asking more of them. Okay. So when we get into what we have identified, there's 15 or 20 different security trends that are happening in the industry right now. But for the purposes of brevity for this webinar, we what we felt like were the top 7. So the first one, the phishing threats. We're all familiar with the phishing threats, and unfortunately, the phishing attacks remain an effective method of stealing credentials and identities, distributing malware, fraudulent payments, and so on. The list goes on and on. And unfortunately, the threat is not going to go away, not just any time soon, but any year soon. So I think it would help. What exactly is a phishing attack? Because we all hear about it, but let's just break it down into very layman explanation. And that is, phishing is a type of social engineering attack that's often used to steal user data. It can include everything from login credentials, credit card numbers, etc. It occurs when an attacker is masquerading as a trusted entity. It tricks a victim into opening an email, an instant message, a text message. The recipient is then fooled into clicking on some type of malicious link, which then can lead to the installation of malware, the freezing of the system, or as part of a ransomware attack, or the revealing of sensitive information. So in simplest terms, that's a phishing attack. And so an organization succumbing to such an attack can sustain moderate to very severe financial losses, possible declining market share, reputation if you're publicly traded or well-known in the industry. Depending on the scope, a phishing attempt might even escalate into a security incident from which a business a lot of times has a difficult time recovering as well. So very, very important that we all understand what a phishing attack is and how we can prevent the risk of receiving those, which we'll talk about. Okay, next on the list is COVID-19. And about 6 months ago, this was not on the list. And so it's amazing to us how quickly the COVID epidemic has also affected us from a security standpoint. And so responding to COVID-19 really remains one of the biggest challenges for most security organizations, whether you're an internal security organization or whether you're an external security organization. It's remaining one of the biggest challenges. And because the pandemic, it's forcing a lot of changes in the business world, and with so many people working remotely, it's really accelerated the digitalization of business processes, endpoint mobility, the expansion of cloud computing in most organizations. And so it's not this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Those progressions needed to happen, but many security organizations can't keep up with the new vulnerabilities that are being produced as a result of these changes, because it's starting to reveal a lot of our legacy thinking and the legacy technologies sometimes that we had in place. Another point on COVID is that, and you need to be aware of this, is that cyber criminals, they're also taking advantage of the widespread global communications on coronavirus to mask their activities. A good example is malware, spyware, Trojans have been found embedded in interactive coronavirus maps and websites. And when you click on them, it also can download malware onto your local desktop or laptop. And spam emails are also tricking users into clicking on links which download the malware into their computers and mobile devices. So again, be very, very cautious on what you're viewing and what you're receiving and clicking on. Pausing just for a second, Cynthia, to see if any questions have come in since then.
Thank you, Chuck. No questions have come in. For those of you that may have joined a little bit late, there is a chat feature in the WebEx. You may send your questions to me via chat, and I will bring them to the attention of the presenter. Or there's also a Q&A panel. So whatever works best for you. We do highly encourage questions, but no questions at this point, Chuck.
Okay, great. So the next topic is data breaches, right? Data breaches can be one of the top cyber threats that we're facing now. They're also reporting to be the biggest cybersecurity concern, and it's likely to continue for as long as personal data remains a valuable black market commodity, which it is today. Ensuring that your data privacy and especially the security of personal data, it's likely to remain top of mind for most organizations, or it should be. In part, this is also due to increasingly stringent privacy legislation. A good example of the privacy legislation that's recently come out is the European Union's GDPR, which has very strict control about where you can host and manage information about your employees or patient information as well. So organizations are becoming more and more aware of the negative consequences of a breach for their image and the penalties associated with violating legislations. Next one is ransomware attacks. So we've all heard about the companies that are being held ransom. You're not hearing about all of them, I can promise you that, because the FBI InfraGard will tell you that not all breaches are being reported because the company does not want the press from that breach. And so based just on the statistics we have, it's still pretty scary. And so ransomware attacks still provide a very solid source of income for international cybercrime. And when we say international, that doesn't exclude the United States. It's international coming into the United States holding U.S. companies for ransom. And so effective protection requires not just proper cybersecurity training for all employees and business partners, but also in-depth security and vulnerability management to prevent attackers from obtaining the confidential information that's used in phishing attempts. So again, what is ransomware? Very layman's definition of ransomware is, in its most basic form, ransomware is malicious software that can infect your computer and displays messages demanding a fee to be paid in order for your system to work again.
Hey,
yes.
Hey, Chuck, you mind if I add into that just for a second there?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, just one, maybe a couple of points I want to make on that. So with ransom, one of the things that we're particularly seeing is that the people that do this, that it used to be more automated and more like a malware, and nowadays what tends to happen is it's more of a hybrid approach where real people are breaking into the company networks, the organizational networks, and then what they will do is they will go find the backups, your company backups. They'll delete that information and then turn loose the ransom. So it's just an interesting evolution in the tactic in that space. Sorry for interrupting, Chuck.
No, great color commentary.
Yeah, and Chuck and Sean, I'd like to add to that too. So to Sean's point, really around the backups, and that goes into overall, when designing your infrastructure, designing the infrastructure itself is making sure that you're taking those type of security measures in mind. So a lot of companies backups, which is scary, resides on the same network as your production or test dev or DR. There's no security measures in place to segment those anyway. So once somebody that is in your network has the ability to load the ransomware, they then have the ability to access to your backup. So that's another major thing to take in consideration as well.
Yeah, very good point, James. Totally agree. We have about 10 to 12 really interesting statistics on ransomware from FBI InfraGard Cybersecurity Division. I'm going to give you two quick ones, again, for brevity purposes. But FBI InfraGard reports that the cost of ransomware is definitely on the rise. It estimates that the global cost for ransomware will reach $20 billion by 2021. This is an increase from the estimated damages of $11.5 billion in 2019 and $8 billion in 2018. And again, that's for the cases that have been reported. Not all of them have been reported. And then the other statistic, which I think is extremely important too, is that the average size of ransomware victims as of Q3 of 2019 is 645 employees. And the reason that's so interesting is that because typically ransomware and hackers would go after the larger corporations. And in, I think it was, quarter 2 of 2019, the average size organization was 925 employees. Now it's 645. So they're seeing that the smaller sized businesses are just as lucrative as the larger ones, which means, and sometimes more lucrative, because the smaller sized businesses don't have the budget and the infrastructure in place to protect themselves the way the larger ones do. So if you're working for an organization between 25 and 700 to 1,000 employees, you need to be keenly aware that your target profile is becoming increasingly more lucrative for these ransomware attackers. Okay, if there's no other comments or questions, I'll continue on to internal cybersecurity awareness and training. And this is one area that we see most companies fall really short on, which is disappointing because it's the easiest and least expensive method of prevention. Cybersecurity training is to really help employees protect themselves and the company against cyber attacks and threats. And the training really empowers the employees with an up-to-date know-how on how to recognize and mitigate a cyber threat. You can have as little as quarterly 30-minute training, how to make your password more complicated, posters in the break room. You can have seminars. You can have little stickies on everybody's laptop or their mouse pads. The most recent statistic that we have discovered is that about 66% of most breaches happen internally and not necessarily intended, and a lot unintended, just because they're not trained and they're not educated on good cybersecurity behavior. And training can go a long way to prevent that. Okay, next one is the cybersecurity skills gap. This is an alarming statistic, really, because it's good if you're in the cybersecurity. If you're a cybersecurity engineer or in the cybersecurity field, this is a great statistic for you. But for everybody else, it just piles on to the additional concerns, and that is that the demand for cybersecurity professionals continues to exceed supply, even though security teams have to deal with more threats than ever. There are as of 60 days ago, there are over 1 million cybersecurity positions open in the cybersecurity field in the United States alone. 1 million positions. So that's pretty staggering. And 2 in 3 organizations worldwide, not just in the United States, but worldwide, are reporting a shortage of IT security staff. They don't have the automated security tools, and as a result, outsourced managed security services are fast becoming a good option and solution to maintaining a good security posture as well. Okay. The last issue or trend that on this slide are the cloud security issues. And I touched on it a little bit earlier, but as business processes and infrastructure and data are increasingly moved to the cloud, protecting information and critical infrastructure really requires completely new approaches to enterprise security. Cloud-based threats will inevitably continue to grow. Organizations are struggling to maintain control of the critical data, ensure real-time threat intelligence, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Improperly secured or configured data buckets increase the risk of major data breaches for organizations. Doesn't matter the size. And unauthorized cloud services really can also all too easily be added by end users. So when you couple all these together, a lot of issues that come up from trying to protect an organization from these cloud security issues, and that organizations are discovering that the manual security management is no longer feasible. Just you can't keep up with it. So they really have to rethink their approach to cybersecurity through some type of managed security service, whether that's an internal service or an external service. The managed security service is a great way to address a lot of not just the cloud security issues, but these previous 6 that I just mentioned. Okay, next slide, please, Cynthia. Okay, now that we've given you sort of a background on the issues or the trends that we're seeing, James wants to talk a little bit about what are some of the catalysts for this, and from a business risks perspective to your business, what should you be aware of?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chuck. So as Chuck touched on his last bullet on the 7 trends is the cloud security. So that's a really good transition into one of driving factors, right? And the way I like to break it down is there's business factors, there's IT factors, then there's the effect, the risk, and the overall impact. So from a business perspective, when we look at security catalysts, really we're looking at increase in revenue, right? So those things are driving new initiatives, they're funding new projects. Those things are really changing the way your overall business is going to run. Ultimately, that's kind of a trickle-down effect, because then that impacts what IT needs to do, what security needs to do, what development needs to do in those areas, right? The other piece is loss of revenue. So that's another major business factor, because losing revenue, and people are seeing that right now, tying it back to what Chuck said about COVID-19, as well as companies are having to downsize and reduce employee, and it's impacting the IT market as well. Their funding for security and other things for smaller companies are starting to go by the wayside as well. So those 2 are major, major factors when it comes to security catalysts, right? A couple of other ones is, overall, remote employee growth. Going back to, COVID-19, a lot of companies really had to push their staff outside their traditional brick and mortar walls and, work from home and or kind of other office, solutions. So that's another major factor. That's a security catalyst that companies have to plan for. Compliance and compliance by proxy, and really from a business perspective, there's a lot of companies that are publicly traded that completely understand compliance, but their companies that they work that they do business with are not always that well versed in compliance. So that's where I call compliance by proxy. If you're doing business with a publicly traded company, expect to see those type of regulatory compliance requirements trickle down to you as well. That's something that your business needs to plan for. That's only going to become more and more stringent to do business with the federal government or doing business with a publicly traded company. And one of the other major ones is really digital transformation, which has been going on over the last couple of years, of course. A key buzzword term that's been used in the industry for several years now, but it's really making an impact to not just the larger companies now, but also the small and medium business companies as well, is really trying to take advantage and transform with the integration of digital technologies. So those are just some of the main business factors. And how do those things really start to impact IT? Really, digital transformation and some of the compliance or revenue growth are driving cloud adoption. So the use of public, private, hybrid cloud technologies are quickly and have been replacing outdated infrastructures. SaaS-based applications as well are starting to and have been replacing those kind of traditional infrastructure environments. So other major factors, from an IT perspective is, increased security concerns around compliance. So those companies that are dealing with federal entities or publicly traded companies or any industry that's heavily regulated, they're starting to see those things impact them. So it's not just the IT controls for those companies. It's now you're having to get in line your IT controls in place just to do business. So just kind of like an entry fee almost in a way. So those are major things that are impacting IT and really increasing that security budget or requirement for a security budget. Overall maturity, IT maturity, when you start talking about increase in revenue for businesses and things like that, the demand is there and is created for IT, and they're requiring a more mature IT, overall IT environment or infrastructure. So, of course, business growth is going to drive IT maturity. Digital transformation is really going to drive IT maturity, and it's also going to it's also an impact on skill set. So, to Chuck's point, as these business factors are coming into play, IT is really impacted, from a skill set perspective, a cloud adoption perspective, overall IT maturity, and even mobile workforce as well. Those are some major ones from an IT perspective that really are security catalysts, right? And the reason I say those are security catalysts is the effect. So a lot of these are pushing your protection boundaries outside of your traditional brick and mortar. It has been for some time now, right, with the adoption of cloud and private, public, public, private, and hybrid, as well as, companies that are really, using hyperscalers as well. So protection boundaries, right? So the effect of that is now you're not just securing your organization from a brick and mortar perspective or your cloud services or just your software as a service. It's really anything that is on your network, right? An endpoint, a remote user that could be working from home or anything like that now falls within your protection boundaries. And as more technologies get pushed outside those traditional protection boundaries, you have to plan for that and secure that as well. I'll pause there to see if there's any questions before I hit on risks and overall impacts. All right. So from a risk perspective, so what does all this mean? You have these driving business factors, IT factors, you have the effects of the impact on your protection boundaries. Really, it's the source of breaches. Chuck touched on a lot of them in the 7 trends in the previous slide. And really, it's, your malicious outsiders, malicious insiders, state-sponsored attacks, accidental loss, or internal, really malicious insiders, and really those are some of the major sources of breaches that we're seeing, with one from a lack of security or really because somebody is not investing a lot in security. And what is that overall impact to the business then? Is really your unauthorized data disclosures, your breach, and overall downtime as well. And then the next slide, if you could, Cynthia, move to the next one, please. It's really what does that look like from a risk to the business perspective, right? So, there's multiple threat vectors that we talked about, like your phishing attacks and 365 phishing attacks and malware and hackers and all those type of threat vectors, right? And you can see, those things can cause, financial loss, operational disruption or business disruption, safety degradation or overall or safety disaster as well. So just depending on what threat vector is utilized, really can damage your overall environment based on what you have secured. So another major one is really loss of reputation. So to Chuck's point about there's a lot of ransomware attacks and that information's not being leaked. Well, the reason that information is not being released is because it could cause a loss of reputation in a publicly traded company that could also contribute to a drop in stock price as well. To the far right, we could talk about tooling, all day long about how do we protect against these overall threat vectors. But just to name a few, there are certain things that need to be put in place, at a basic level. And from overall security programs to phishing, tooling, to, 2FA, multi-factor, endpoint security, and things like that. So these are just to name a few, but really in the next slide, Sean's really going to start to go into the overall approach and really the right approach to take versus just looking at here's my threat vector and here is the tooling to mitigate that. So with that, Sean, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Hey, thank you, James, for that. Let's see, this slide, the security journey or the security cycle journey. Really, what I'm trying to say here is I see organizations come into security through a number of different ways, but ultimately it really, they start in two principal places. So at the top, you see assessment, and then unfortunately, there's also incident response. And so what this slide is trying to convey is that there's sort of a journey that organizations go through. And not only to get into security in the first place, to kind of quit ignoring it and putting it on the back burner, but also to enter into that mode of ongoing improvement. So this is just something that we've seen. It's just how it tends to happen. It's not the absolute way of things, but it's just kind of our view on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start around the circle, starting with assessment. So before you really do anything, what you want to understand is what exactly are you dealing with from a security standpoint, and that's where an assessment comes in. So you'll assess, okay, and let me give you an example from the real world. Even a security assessment could probably do inspection report. So you hire someone, they come out, they have a look at your house, they let you know, hey, this is wrong or this is right, that sort of thing. So very similar in the assessment world with your security posture. You hire someone, they'll come out, they'll have a look, and they'll kind of give you an idea of the types of things that you could improve upon. But within that space, there's a variety of ways of conducting assessment. And so what you really want to do is make sure that whoever you hire to do this is using a standards-based approach, and that standard is right for your organization. So you can have a all-encompassing standard, such as NIST or some of the federal type frameworks, or you can use something that's more applicable to a commercial entity or a smaller business, such as CIS Top 20. In any case, just make sure that they're using a good standard that works for your business. And then there's also different things to look at. So you can have them come in and look at your configuration and look at your architecture. But at the same time, there's also the unknown unknowns. So I mentioned that point earlier. And that's where something like a penetration test comes in, where someone will come in and they'll attempt to actually pretend like they're a hacker and see what all they can get into. There's not necessarily a right or wrong with either one, just it's a different approach, and it helps get you a different level of assurance depending on what your objectives and so forth are. Following on that, and I'm going to pause for just a second and see if there's any questions and grab a drink of water. With go ahead.
No, thank you, Sean. No questions currently, but again, for everyone, please feel free to chat me any questions or use the Q&A or raise your hand to be unmuted. We welcome your questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and Sean, I'd actually like to add on to that as well as, I always like to look at, this security life cycle journey as a really as this continual improvement process, right? So, and that's why I think just security in general needs to be treated, so you're always assessing what you have, you're properly training your people, and really, and you're learning from what you're finding, and it really is a true life cycle.
Yeah, thanks for that, James. Let's see. So the next section that we're going into is training. So really, the one point I want to drive home, if you guys remember anything from this thing when you go home today, is try to make your training personally relevant. It is all too easy. You can go out to Google and you can just order securitytraining.com or whatever it is, and very quickly you can check the box. But what we have found over and over and over again with security training is the people that are participating really have to personally connect. And when they do that, the phishing attempts, the clicking on the links they shouldn't, all that type of stuff really starts to drop. And the other thing with training is in my view, it acts as a bit of a buffer or a way to kind of soften the ground, not only for your general user population, but for your executive and management audience as well. So if you can come in and kind of help educate those folks, the people with the purse strings, so to speak, they can really start to align, or that helps better align, and this will tie into the next section, your business objectives with security, rather than just doing security just for the sake of it. So with that said, program and policies is the next thing I would really emphasize. And really what you're trying to build. So this is your policies, your procedures. All too often what happens is organizations, they'll go out, they'll have a set of policies, but they just start gathering dust. No one uses them. No one knows where they're at. Maybe they don't work for the organization. So what you want to do is take those policies, take the procedures that you have, and even if you have nothing, just pick a standard and develop a set of policies according to that standard, and then lay that foundation that works with your organization. Okay, every organization is different, and then once you have that foundation, you can start looking at other things. And something else that we also see is lots of times organizations really have no idea where to begin. So again, as I mentioned with the assessment, you can just pick a standard like the CIS Top 20 is a good one. Or if you have federal compliance requirements, there's always NIST 853, but there's a number of different standards you could use. And then once you've got that standard, you've got those policies, then you're going to start pushing on the program, which means getting the budget aligned with the controls that have been selected for your security program. Those things should align with your business. Once you have all this foundational elements in place, you can then start to look more so at technology and services. So in some cases, it may make more sense to do things in-house, just depending on what it is. And in other cases, you may find, you know what, it just costs too much money to spin up a security operations center internally. That may be something you want to look outside for. And so what you'll do is you'll go in, you'll take the results of the assessment, you'll take your program and policies in conjunction with your training, and start to look at which technology and services can help fill the gap with where you're at. And by gaps, I mean the security holes, the things that need to be fixed in your security posture. And then lastly, presuming there's no other questions, I'll just keep going unless we get one. Moving into an incident response, unfortunately, this shows where organizations really haven't taken the time to prepare, and these are always sad calls to take because the customer or the people that we're interacting with are typically in a frantic state, and they're trying to understand what has happened, how to deal with the issue, and so forth. And then so many times they'll come in and we'll start to look at it. They don't have any information to reconstruct what actually happened. They have no logging, or they don't have enough logging, or all kinds of different things have happened where they just don't have a plan in place. They don't know who to contact. So you really want to have all of these things in place in advance. And that starts right at the program and policies and ultimately back to that initial assessment. And as James said, all this kind of continues in a circle. So you want to work towards continuous improvement. And you know what? I mentioned CIS Top 20, but let's say you can't be the top 20 today. Well, you can pare that down and start with just 6. So just pick 6 and get started. And that will get you prepared for the things that we're facing in the new security paradigm. We'll pause it just for a second if there's any questions. Okay.
No questions, Sean.
Next slide, please.
Okay, Chuck here again. And so one of the common mistakes that we see in a lot of organizations is they invest the money in having a comprehensive security assessment, as Sean just described, and then they'll even remediate the findings, if there are any, for that security assessment. But then they feel like, okay, we've done our minimum requirement and we don't need to worry about that for another year. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of companies fall short because they're not willing or they don't understand how to implement a governance program for the ongoing monitoring and management of their security posture. And so as the graphic on the right describes at a very high level, ongoing governance program includes a lot of the things Sean just talked about. A really solid information security program management plan. So what is our 6-month, 12-month, 18, 24-month security strategy? What is our plan? How are we going to budget for it? And what types of security measures do we want to implement? And what are we trying to protect? As part of that, you have to develop security policies, as Sean's mentioned. If you have a incident, what type of policies do you have in place? What type of password reset policies do you have in place? Today, in the past, it used to be you need to reset your password every 90 days, and now the best practice guideline is you don't have to necessarily change it every 90 days, but you need to make it as long and as complicated as possible, and maybe change it once a year. And so that's part of a good example of a security policy. And in your IT security plans that you're going to be implementing that include your standard operating procedures. A good example of a standard operating procedure is, what do you do in the event of a disaster? You should have a documented set of procedures that says, here's what we do in the event of a disaster. Here are my escalation points. Here are my recovery points, etc. And then continuity of operations. So after the disaster, you need to maintain operations. How do you maintain operations? You should have very comprehensive, documented, standard operating procedures for maintaining operations during a disaster. Information system guidelines, and again, that could come from what Sean was talking about, SANS Top 20. There are several out there that are very good guidelines that will also provide you with information technology standards. And if you're publicly traded, you got to be compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley. If you're healthcare, you got to be compliant with HIPAA. Whatever standard that you're trying to be compliant with, you need to have those documented and the procedures and guidelines to show how you're becoming compliant with those standards in the event of an audit. And then evidentiary artifacts, very critical for passing audits and demonstrating your due diligence, such as Sean was just talking about in terms of log management, log management and monitoring. So you can, with a hit of a keyboard button, you can produce a report that says, here's all the activity that happened in our network and our infrastructure as well. And so I guess the last thing I would mention about a comprehensive governance plan is making sure you have an effective ongoing security monitoring and management service in place. And again, whether it's internal, you have your own internal department, or whether it's outsourced to a firm like Diopath, it's vitally important that you have an ongoing monitoring and management service. That's probably the most important aspect of an overall governance program. Okay, next slide.
Here, Chuck, can we go back just real quick? Just want to make one point on one. Just real quick on the disaster recovery and some of these other things. One of the things that's really important there is just to make sure that you, it's not necessarily having a completely documented every single possible thing that can happen. The important part is going through that exercise and thinking about what could happen and capturing that information. So that's something that a lot of people, we get so focused on getting everything documented that we lose sight of why we're doing that in the first place. The other point I want to mention is with the guidelines and in particular the password rotation. People get tired of having to rotate their password every 90 days, right? We've all heard that. We all hate it. But what has happened is recently the federal government has changed a few things in that space, and they are now recommending that you just make longer passwords. So I keep emphasizing just use a passphrase like a sentence, and typical users are more receptive to that. They don't complain as much. And the bonus is now you have something to hang your hat on because the federal government said this is the way to do things. So it's kind of a win-win for all. Back to you, Chuck.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Good point.
Okay, and a path forward. So, guys, through this last several slides, admittedly, some of this can look kind of like doom and gloom and perhaps can be quite intimidating. But the message here is, you know what? Actually getting better. I've been in this business for about 20 years, and there was a time when the hackers were winning. There was no way to keep up. And I think the tide has turned. And you see the points on there. The community is becoming more connected. So Microsoft and Google and your Firefoxes and all these different software vendors, they're talking a lot more nowadays. Likewise, the tools are just getting better and better. The things that we had to perform our vulnerability scans 20 years ago, it's like a Model T compared to what is available nowadays. and the price is just so much cheaper than it ever used to be. So better quality, less cost, good thing for everyone. And of course, the affordability. It's I think a big part of that is competition in this space is really starting to drive price down. So you guys have a lot more choices than you ever had. It's just kind of a brave new world in that the hackers aren't winning nearly as much as they used to, in my view. And it a lot boils down to tooling and maturity and community growing together. One other thing to add to that, though, is with the mindset of the world. It used to be the security was more on the back burner. It was something that we thought about, and if we had time, we would try to do it. But that all is changing. You know what the stories are. I'm sure you guys have heard from your friends, and you've seen the newspapers. There's people on boards that are now concerned, and they're trying to take care of things. And so it's funding is loosening up. So you're able to get your projects funded in this space. And then the other thing that I find really interesting is it used to be in the cybersecurity insurance space, they would ask something like, do you have a firewall? Yes, I have a firewall. And you would get 2 thumbs up for that. But nowadays, they are really starting to ask more serious questions, such as, do you have a SIEM, or do you have a number of other different components that ordinarily they wouldn't even look at. In fact, they are asking, how are these things configured nowadays? So it's a good in that the insurance providers are able to offer better coverage, but it also means that there's it's upping the game for everyone across the board. Overall, I think it's a win. I think we're getting better, and I think it looks like a bright future from my perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, Sean, just add one thing to that. Everybody in the industry, from the providers to the cyber insurance companies, the organizations, everybody's getting more educated. So they're asking, the banks asking more and more educated questions. So it's important that you as an organization are well equipped and educated.
Awesome.
Okay, I think we have one more slide, Cynthia. Okay, so we've discussed what our view of the security world is by identifying what we feel are the top 7 trends. We've tried to relate that to how does that affect you from a business standpoint, from a risk standpoint. Could it be monetary? Could it be reputation? Could it be the image, etc.? And then we've given you some outline or suggestions on how you can help mitigate some of that with the right approach to managing your overall security posture. And so this last slide is we've talked about managed security, and really the first 4, starting from the top to the bottom, are all proactive type measures that you can implement. So what type of email security do you have in place? There's several types of services that you can have. What type of perimeter security do you in place? What kind of vulnerability management, and what kind of endpoint security? So how are you protecting your network inside and out from a proactive standpoint by implementing good, solid technologies with a good, solid overall security program? And then the last 2 really are more reactive from a standpoint. So detection and response from a service that can actually identify threats coming in on a real-time basis, and how we can prevent those threats from actually infecting your infrastructure and causing any damage. And then professional services, wrapping it all up with, on an annual, quarterly type basis, how can we also come in and help organizations assess their current security posture against industry standards, create any type of gap analysis based on best recommendations, saying that your security posture is here, best practices say you really should be here, and we can rank from severe to mild to low, and how can you implement a cost-effective return on investment to make sure that you've created an overall comprehensive security program. So those are the the 6 pillars of managed security that's also available. As Sean said, that's the good news. There are ways to combat this ever-growing threat. So with that in mind, we want to open it up for any type of question and answers that anybody may have. We're happy to answer any question or go back and discuss any topic. I believe we have about 4 or 5 minutes left, and happy to do so.
And just to remind everyone, you can chat me your questions, raise your hand, or use the Q&A function, whatever works best for you. You're watching that now for any questions that anybody may have for Chuck or James or Sean.
Well, either nobody has any questions or we just did a really thorough job and answered them all during the presentation. But whatever the case is, we really do appreciate your attendance in this webinar. We hope it was educational and informative for you. And you can rest assured that DialPath as a company is constantly, every day, 24 hours a day, living in the trenches to try and make the security world that much easier for our customers. So Cynthia, do you have any concluding remarks?
I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and thank our panelists. This was a very informative webinar. We greatly appreciate hosting everyone. We hope y'all have a lovely rest of your week. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day.